What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. You might notice this is a longer video than usual. I've been thinking of interspersing some longer compilation videos throughout the week in addition to the weekend, but unlike the compilation on Sunday, these are stories that I've double-checked to make sure that I have never read before. So these are all new stories that you can enjoy just like my normal videos. Like compilations on Sunday though, all the ads will be at the very beginning after the first 2 or 3 stories. So after that, you won't have to worry about any more ads and you can just listen to this video in the background like a podcast or as background noise or however you'd like to. Let me know what you guys think, and without further ado, I will let you guys enjoy the stories in this video. Please enjoy and have a great day. Let me start off by saying I'm a female, and I'm not a typical mail carrier. I was hired specifically to deliver mail in the rural areas of town I live close to. I don't walk door to door like most mail carriers you see. I usually have to drive to each mailbox individually. Out here in the country, they can be quite far and few between. Although every once in a while, I do have to leave the truck and carry the package directly to someone's door, usually because their mailbox has been so overgrown with weeds it's rusted shut or something. Or in some cases, they simply don't even have one anymore. Something creepy happened on my 3rd day of work though. I had parked my truck and started walking a long driveway to deliver mail to a house whose mailbox had been completely surrounded by weeds and spider webs. It was raining and I couldn't see very well because of this. My glasses were fogging up as I walked. All of a sudden, I tripped on something and landed in a puddle. I couldn't believe that just happened. I was now completely soaked. I scrambled to my feet and looked around to see what I had just tripped on. I couldn't see anything though. I was confused and pissed off now. I bent down to pick up the mail I had dropped, which was now also soaked. After gathering all of it up, I started to jog over to the front door. I rang the doorbell and slid the mail in through the slot. I turned around and started heading back down the long driveway. I was jogging, trying to get back to my warm truck as fast as I could. As I got closer though, I saw a man was standing by the front of my truck. When he saw that I'd noticed him, he ducked behind it, almost like a child would when trying to hide from an adult. Right after that, I heard a noise come from behind me. I turned around. Now there were 2 men standing on the porch, watching me. The male was sitting at their feet. The way they were just standing there watching me leave was so creepy. I made it back to my truck and walked around it. The man that had been hiding earlier was nowhere to be seen now. I didn't feel very safe, needless to say. I jumped inside my truck and locked the door. I drove away from there as fast as possible. I was freezing cold for the rest of the day due to falling into that stupid puddle earlier. The next day, I pulled up to the same house. It wasn't raining anymore, and I could see more clearly. As I began to walk the driveway, I stopped when I noticed a long, thin wire stretching across right before the big puddle I'd fallen into the day before. I couldn't believe my eyes. Then I noticed a person crouched down behind the bushes right next to the puddle. I immediately turned around and started walking back to my truck. When I got there, I jumped inside and locked the door. I started to drive away. As I did this, I looked back up the driveway and saw the man standing up now next to the puddle. The same 2 men who'd been staring at me earlier were standing on the front porch again, too. I had an argument with my boss later about switching routes permanently. I didn't want to be close to that house ever again. Eventually he did agree, and I never did go back there again, nor did I ever hear about anyone else having trouble delivering mail to that house. I was a pizza delivery girl when I was younger, and this night I was delivering to a house I had never been to before. I went up to the front door and nobody answered when I rang the doorbell. Nobody answered at all. I returned to my car to take the pizza back and get my next delivery. At some point during my drive back though, I glanced into my rearview mirror, only to notice a person sitting in my back seat. I swerved my car and slammed right into another car that was parked nearby. I stopped the brakes while screaming. I jumped out of the car as quickly as I could, and the person in the back just started laughing at my fear. I ran into the street and stopped a nearby car to try and get help. The person in the back seat must have been very ill in the head or something. They didn't even try to hurt me or get out of the car to follow me, but when the police pulled them from my vehicle, they found the person had a small pocket knife clutched in their hand the entire time. When I was little, I spent a lot of time at the park. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, and she would often take me and my friends there almost every day during the summer. If we were lucky, she would buy us each something from the ice cream truck as well. This was one of those lucky days. This story takes place when I was 6 or 7 years old. My mom had taken me and 3 other girls from the neighborhood to play at the park. It was a sunny, warm, and pretty much absolutely ideal day. The kind you might see in movies or something. Everyone was in a very good mood, my mom included. When we heard the ice cream truck approaching, she gave us all some money to go buy some treats, opting to hang back for a moment and chat with her friend. After all, we weren't going to be leaving her sight anyway, so it's not like anything bad could happen. As we approached, I noticed the ice cream truck wasn't the same one we usually saw. That wasn't unheard of though. There were always quite a few different ice cream trucks driving around town. They would all kind of compete to hit the park crowd, so it was to be expected. This one looked kind of run down though. When you're 7, that doesn't really matter. Ice cream is ice cream all the same. My friends and I raced to get in line, and were delighted to be the first ones there. The ice cream man seemed just as excited to see us too. "I have a special treat for you girls today," he told us as we handed him our money, silencing a request for our usual favorites. We were all skeptical, but he kept insisting his special treat was so much yummier than any ice cream we'd ever had before. We all shrugged and agreed. Like I said, ice cream is ice cream to young kids. The man disappeared into the back of the truck for a few minutes, and we could hear him giggling. Now I would find this a bit creepy, but at the time I actually thought it was kind of funny. A few minutes later, he handed us what looked to be ordinary ice cream sundaes. "I promise they're extra good. Don't waste any," he told us, giving us a wink. As we started walking back to my mom, the ice cream truck left immediately. I remember thinking something was pretty off about that. Usually trucks would stay around much longer, getting as much business from all the kids as they possibly could. That didn't stop me from eating the ice cream though. While I was eating, I noticed that something tasted off. Soon my friends were all complaining about how their ice cream tasted funny too. My mom had noticed how quickly the truck had left, so she insisted on tasting mine just to be safe. I'll never forget how quickly she marched us out of the park that day, or how horrified she looked at the time. I didn't understand why she was so upset back then. That was until years later. I was finally old enough for her to tell me the ice cream had tasted like enemies. The ice cream truck guy had baited into our sundaes. The real horror story though was realizing my mother recognized the taste of enemies right away. The police questioned my friends and I about the man in the truck, but none of us were able to give a good description at the time. I think they must have tested the DNA in the ice cream. I don't really remember much from the whole investigation though, because my mom shielded me from it. I do know, however, that they never caught the guy in the end. 1 year ago, I was sitting on my grandpa's bedside as he was passing away. I'd been very close to this man my entire life. I'm in my 30s now. As he was laying there asleep, I was on my phone when suddenly he turned towards me. He whispered in my ear, "Daniel, I need to tell you something." I told him okay, and then he proceeded to share with me the most shocking story I'd ever heard. He told me he'd brutally murdered his first wife and her son. I was in complete shock. I asked him how and why he had done this. He told me that one night he'd gotten extremely angry. He grabbed an old hammer from his garage and beat them to death. Hearing this completely blew my mind because he was the kindest man I have ever known. At least, I thought so before this. He told me that nobody ever found out it was him. He cleaned up all the blood himself and got rid of all the evidence too. I tried to act as normal as possible after hearing this. I had to leave the room to catch my breath. Shortly after, I sat down in the hospital hallway near his room and tried to think of what I should do. I eventually went back into his room and asked him if anybody else knew about what he had done. He told me that nobody did, but he was ready to come clean now. Only he didn't want to do it himself. He wanted me to tell everybody else for him. I got very upset at him. How could I do that? I told him I wouldn't. He got extremely emotional after I said this and began to cry. I left his hospital room and drove home. 3 days later, my father called me and told me he had passed away. I still hadn't told anybody about what he'd said, not even my own wife. Months later, I was helping my father and my uncle clean out some of my grandpa's things. That was when I noticed in the garage, hidden in the very back behind everything, was a little tool rack, and on this rack was a very old-looking hammer. It brought chills up my spine. I told my father and uncle about what he'd said that day. It took some long, convincing, and big arguments, but they eventually believed what I'd said. My father went to the authorities with the information. It's a very strange feeling to both miss a person you loved so much in your life, but equally hate them for what they left you with. I miss my grandpa every day, but he's the biggest coward I've ever known. I took the hammer to my house after. I often glance at it and wonder if that's the very same hammer he used to murder his wife and stepson. A few years ago, my ex-husband and I were eating at the mall with my 2-year-old daughter in tow. She was happily munching away on a cookie and watching Yo Gabba Gabba on my phone. All of a sudden, this old Japanese man, probably at least 70 years old, walked up to us and started commenting on how pretty she was. She had curly strawberry blonde hair and green eyes as well. Her skin was pretty pale. He went on to say how she looked so healthy. I said thank you. In my experience, old people seem to always love adorable kids, so I didn't freak out immediately. Then though, he proceeded to stroke her cheek and run his hands through her hair. He talked about how he should take her to his office because he was a pediatrician. He would love to treat her. I picked her up from her high chair and held her in my lap so he couldn't touch her again. My ex-husband tried to politely shoo him away, but the guy just wouldn't take the hint. While I was holding her, he bent over me and ran his hands over her leg. He gave me this creepy smile. "It's okay, I'm a pediatrician." I scooted back, glaring. "Don't touch my kid." I stood up to start putting her in her stroller to leave. As we did so, the man followed us out to the car, asking if he could play with her. A few weeks passed by, and I went back to the very same mall. I once again had an encounter with this man. This time though, my ex-husband was at work. I was in Sephora and picking up some makeup. I had my back turned for about 20 seconds, when all of a sudden I heard my daughter crying out for me. I turned around to see the old man had picked up my daughter. I got her back from the man and loudly told him to get the fuck away from my child. I rushed to get mall security, but when they came back to search for the man, he had already disappeared into nowhere. We never went back to that mall after. I used to work at a place which was required to be manned 24 hours a day. The reason being was that it handled sensitive documents and files. If somebody needed this information in the middle of the night, I would have to fetch it for them, or confirm that I had it otherwise. Security here is very tight. There are bars on the windows and multiple locked doors to get to where I am. And they would often give me work to do during the night as well, but they underestimated how quickly I could get it done. This meant that most nights I finished my work in like 30 minutes or so. The rest of the time I just pulled out my phone and played games, browsed Netflix, or searched on Reddit. Since nobody else was in the building at night, I was very bored waiting for someone to need something. It was getting to the last third of my shift one night when all of a sudden I heard a door close. I looked up to the security camera and saw someone walking down the hall toward my room. At first, I thought it was just someone coming in to work ridiculously early or something. I turned around in my chair and waited for this person to walk through the door so I could greet them. But nobody arrived. The hair started to rise on my back now. This wasn't a really big building at all, so I figured I'd at least find the guy wherever he was. I started checking all the offices and storage rooms, but I came up empty-handed. I did, however, note that a particular fire door had now shut when it had been open before. I went to try and rewind the camera, but I found the digital recording was password protected, and I didn't have the password at the moment. The whole thing freaked me out. The way the person was walking down the hallway, it was so determined, like they were lasered in on where I was. I sat with my spine tingling for the last couple of hours of my shift. Finally, people started to come in, and my replacement showed up as well. I told her what I'd seen. At this point, I figured I must have just imagined the whole thing. I was told to go home, and the manager and the girl who replaced me promised to look over the camera. After getting home, I called my manager and asked what they'd seen. They said that the video showed the fire door closing, but immediately after, it froze for about an hour. The only thing it recorded afterwards was me reopening the door. They never found the guy in the end. I will start off by saying that English is not my first language. Since I'm Dutch, it's a close second. Please forgive me for any errors. This happened to me when I was about 11 or 12 years old. In my country, it's normal for elementary schools to have soccer tournaments for the kids, mostly in the last 2 grades. I decided I was going to support the kids in my grade since we had a few good football players on the team. Obviously, I wanted them to win. I headed over there on my bike. As I'm heading over though, it started to rain really hard. For some reason, I guess being the introvert that I am, I decided I was going to hang out by myself at an intersection that was nearby the field where the tournament was being held. At least I could still see the game from there. All of a sudden though, a white van stopped right in front of me. The light had just turned red. I could see a guy who was about 30-ish, with blonde hair and a very friendly-looking face. He rolled his window down and called out to me. "Hey, you want me to take you to the intersection? It's raining pretty hard now." Apparently, he didn't want to see me get wet, which was bullshit because I was already soaked to the bone. Instantly, I got the gut feeling that something was off about this guy. I remember being really torn, though. One side of me was saying to just go with him. He seemed to mean well. The other side of me, though, was saying that something was definitely wrong here. I declined his offer, but he kept on pestering me. I kept declining and started to back away from his van. The light turned green and he simply said, "Okay then." He drove off. I thought that would be the last time I would see him. 5 to 8 minutes later though, the same guy in the same white van stopped in front of me again. He rolled down his window once more and asked me if I was sure I didn't want a lift. He promised he was just going to drive me to the main intersection. I could even put my bike in the back of his van. This is when I really started to get worried. I said no thank you and started to ride toward the nearest gas station. There were a lot of people there. I was scared, so I waited for about 10 minutes at the gas station before I jumped back on my bike and went full speed toward the field. It seemed to me there were about 1,000 people there. I never saw the guy again after. To this day, I can still recall the guy's face. He seemed like he was acting friendly, so I'll never be able to 100% confirm if his intentions were right or wrong, but I could definitely tell something was off there, especially after he came around again. I wonder if he might have done this to other children, since he seemed a bit more perceptive than the usual creep and had a genuinely nice-seeming persona, not at all like the creepy old man you'd expect. Either way, I hope I don't see that guy ever again. Let me give some context for this briefly. I live in a city that's notorious for 24-hour service. Even for locals who aren't part of the downtown scene, certain amenities are usually open at all hours. This happened about 3 months ago. I hate studying in the afternoon, so I usually go to bed around 6 p.m. or so. Then I wake up at midnight to finish my work. There's this one cafe nearby that has 24 hours in my area. I usually drive down there to study before heading to school in the morning. So this one time I was studying when I realized I needed some colored pens and a large piece of paper for a project the next day. They sell these supplies at grocery stores where I live, so I found one that was nearby and drove over to pick up the stuff real quick. I'm generally pretty aware of my surroundings, so I made sure to park directly under a streetlight in front of the building. My car's windows are pretty tinted, and when the line shines directly on them from above, my visibility remains the same, while nobody else can really see inside. This became quite relevant in just a moment. Anyway, I go inside and do my thing. I'm holding my bags in one hand now, keeping the other with my keys free. After I paid, I started heading out. As I was walking out though, a white van pulled up right in front of where my car was parked and blocked my path to it. A little old lady inside rolled down the passenger window and called out to me. "Excuse me, we're tourists and we can't seem to find the main road back downtown. Could you perhaps come over and give us some directions, young lady?" I didn't stop walking though. I veered quickly in front of their car. "No, I'm sorry, I can't help you." Side note, my city is known for its downtown area. Universally almost, every road leads downtown. Downtown is the fucking lifeblood of the city. And little old ladies don't often visit in their white vans with blacked out windows. The whole thing was just giving off a real creepy vibe. I hurried over to my car and jumped inside. My car is pretty big. My father was an ER doctor and wouldn't let me get anything smaller than an SUV, citing height and weight as a primary safety feature. As I sat down, the van did not pull away though. It remained parked next to my car. I locked the doors immediately and glanced out my passenger side window. This gave me a side view of their car, and due to the height of my own angle, this served to provide just enough of a view through their window tint, which was effective enough to see inside. I saw that in the back seat, there was a man holding a knife. He was holding it up to his chest and appeared to be straining to see through my own windows. I pieced out of there pretty quickly and drove loops through the suburbs until I got to my school. It's nothing too exciting, I suppose, but it was pretty damn scary for me. So for a bit of background, I was 9 at the time and very naive. I was visiting my cousin who used to live in a small town with mostly farms and suburbs. All of us were pretty bored and decided to walk to the park about a mile away and play some baseball together. It was me, my older sister, my 5 guy cousins, and some of their friends. There were about 10 of us walking through the suburbs, so nothing too dangerous was going to happen. We got to the park and played for about an hour and a half. When I wanted to go back, no one else wanted to go though, so I had to go all by myself. I knew the way back well enough though, and it was only the suburbs, so I thought, what's the worst that can happen? While I was walking back though, just across the street, I saw an old man laying down on what I thought was his lawn. He appeared to be quite injured as well, and kept calling out for someone to help him. This man was about his mid-60s, and he looked like he really needed some help. I went over, but I still kept my distance just enough. About 5 feet away, the man kept saying the same thing over and over. I couldn't understand what he was saying though, so I kept on moving just a bit closer. All of a sudden, as I approached him, he shot up from where he was and grabbed my arm fiercely. I began screaming and thrashing as the man used his sudden strength to drag me to a nearby van. I was doing everything in my power to get away from him. Apparently, I was screaming so loud that the neighbors came outside once they saw the man was there. There were other people now coming out too. The man clearly hadn't expected this and let go of me. He ran back to his van and drove away. I didn't speak to anyone who tried to help. I just ran as fast as I could. When I got back to the outside of my house, I calmed down finally. I didn't tell my mother what happened because I didn't want me or my cousins to get in trouble. Obviously, that's an incredibly stupid thing to do in hindsight, but I was very young at the time. The story doesn't end there though. I came back the following year. We were all watching the news when there was a story about a man who was acting like he was in need of help. Once his victims were close enough, he would grab them and try to shove them into his van. Then he would attempt to rear them. This sounded eerily familiar to the events of the previous year. Then the old man's mugshot appeared. I was terrified. It was the exact same guy. I still didn't say anything though about the encounter. I still think about what could have happened to me that day if I hadn't shouted loud enough. I used to nanny full-time. One night, the parents asked me to stay late, almost overnight, so they could go out on a date together. I put all the kids down to bed and loaded up a movie. It was a movie the mom had suggested. It was a horror movie called The Babadook, I believe. Partway through this movie, I paused because I thought I heard the sound of the youngest child coming downstairs. She walked right up to me, looked me dead in the eyes, and said, "Do you want to die?" Without hesitation, I told her to go back to bed. As soon as I hit the play button, though, the little boy in the movie, about the same age as that girl that just walked up to me, asked the mother the exact same question. I thought that was a pretty freaky coincidence, but I chalked it up to maybe her seeing the movie already with her family. When her parents got home, I told her mother about what happened. She told me the child had never seen the movie. And apparently, that's just something she does all the time when she's sleepwalking. I woke up one night in the middle of the night because my cat was crying at my bedroom door. He did this often when he would empty his water bowl to let me know that he needed more. It wasn't really a problem for me until this one night. I got out of bed and right outside my door my cat was waiting. I stood in the doorway for a second and waited for him to turn and start walking away ahead of me. He did so, and as I walked out of the hallway, I turned the corner to the left. Just out of my peripheral vision to my right though, I thought I saw someone standing by my back door. I was so tired and out of it in the moment, I didn't even realize what I'd actually just seen. Somebody was actually inside my house. That was until I entered the kitchen and it finally clicked. You can't even imagine how scary it was to see something like that in books and movies, let alone real life. It was an entirely different experience. I stood there in the kitchen trembling, trying to think of what I should do. I didn't want the person to know I'd seen them already. My eyes started to fill with tears. My husband was still in bed asleep, and to reach him I'd have to walk by that area again. I was sure if I did that, something bad would happen to me, but I didn't know what else to do. Somehow, I don't know how, I made a decision. I would turn the corner and pretend not to see them again. I counted to 5 and started walking. When I turned the corner though, I ran into the man standing right in front of my bedroom door. I screamed and fell backward. The man grabbed at me. My husband rushed out of the room and wrapped his arms around the man's throat. He threw him away from me. My husband said he didn't even hear anything before that, but I swear just before this, I heard a loud noise that sounded like an alarm or something. Thankfully, my husband was able to easily overpower the man, and I ran and grabbed my cell phone. I called 911 as the man was pinned to the ground the whole time. He just kept on saying, "I'll leave, honey, I'll just leave." When the police arrived, I had the front door already open. When they came inside, the crazy man started crying like a child, like uncontrollably. I've never seen anything like it. I've never really been the same since this all happened. It was truly the stuff of nightmares. I've been delivering pizzas for about 3 years now. I was 21 years old when this happened. I have no idea what particular night it was, but I do remember it was pretty late. We had an order placed for one small pizza. I drove out to this house that was located on a lonely dark road with not too many lights on it and not too many houses either. The house I was supposed to deliver to looked quite nice, but it was pitch black inside, no lights on at all. This had happened several times during this job, but it always made me feel a little uneasy. Why would you be ordering pizza and have 0 lights on when the person is supposed to deliver it? I walked up to the porch and gently knocked. It seemed like nobody was home, which made no sense at all. I was secretly hoping nobody would answer though, so I could just leave and get out of there. I was getting an extremely weird vibe. I knocked again and again, but got nothing still. I didn't really care if these people got their pizza or not. I was getting creeped out standing on this dark porch. I turned around to go back to my car, only to stop immediately. I noticed a man was now standing in the middle of the walkway, holding some sort of object. I'm pretty sure it was a crowbar or something like that. I was about to say something, but I couldn't think of what to say in the moment. I quickly realized I was in danger. There was no reason for this guy to just be standing there, blocking my path holding this thing, except to hurt me, or to steal the money I had on me. I put the pizza down on the ledge next to the ashtray and jumped over the side of the porch wall. I started running like a madman into the backyard. I heard the guy give chase behind me, but I was in pretty good shape. I only weighed about 140 pounds, and I was pretty sure I could outrun this guy any day of the week. I hopped the fence in the backyard that led to the neighbor's backyard. I ran and hopped their fence to the left of me after that. I hopped 3 more fences before I ended back up on some street. I started walking fast, out of breath. I walked over to the sidewalk and pulled out my phone to call my boss. He thought I was joking at first, which really pissed me off. I told him to send somebody to get me right away. I hid on the porch of another darkened house. A coworker eventually did pick me up, and I jumped in his car. The whole thing felt so surreal. I couldn't believe any of that just happened to me. We drove back over to the house, where my car was still sitting there on the dark street right in front of it. I told the guy who was driving I was not going to get out to get it until we had the police with us. In fact, as we drove by, I could still see the guy who chased me sitting on the porch. He didn't have that object in his hands anymore though. I could tell he was watching me as we drove by. We sped off and I called the police. We met them nearby, but by the time we got back to the house, the guy was already long gone. The police knocked on the door a few times, and then eventually opened up the front door of the house. As we looked inside, we realized the house was completely vacant. There was nothing inside at all, no furniture or anything. This scared me so much, I got back into my car and went back to the pizza place. I quit pretty much right away. My family and my girlfriend convinced me while I was on the way there that it was time to get another job. Delivering pizza can be pretty dangerous work. A girl in my high school English class once told me a very scary story. She was 4 years old at the time this happened, and she lived in a house backing onto a park with no fence around her backyard. She had this sliding glass door in her room that opened out to the parkway. It was in the middle of the night, and she was fast asleep when she suddenly began to hear a banging at the door. Being a little kid, she hid underneath her blankets in fear. In the morning, when it had all finally passed, she uncovered herself, only to discover a dead woman covered in blood just outside the door. The door was smeared in blood all the way down the glass. Apparently, the woman had been attacked in the park and run for help. She was trying to get someone else in the house to help her, but she ended up getting stabbed to death right there on the girl's back porch. This story actually happened to my father way back in the 1970s in his home country of Fiji. Because of this, there's not really any way I can get any type of newspaper articles or anything like that to prove it to you, but I assure you this is real. My mom, at least, has verified the story, and my other uncles as well. They claim it's 100% legit, so here we go. My dad lived in a farming area, and each of the farmhouses were a few miles apart from one another. When my dad was about 14 years old or so, he was invited to a sleepover at his uncle's house. My dad was very fond of this particular uncle, so he agreed and went over for the night. The uncle had a wife and 3 kids. Their ages were 3, 4, and also a baby that was about 6 months old. All in all, they had a great time eating, chatting, and playing together. When it was about time for bed, my dad went to sleep, only to wake up a short time later to a huge noise. He could hear what sounded like screaming and something that sounded like a gunshot as well. He ran to his uncle's room, only to see his uncle shooting his wife and kids. My dad freaked out and ran away. He ran across the house and tried to exit through a door that would lead outside, only to find all the doors were jammed and would not open. His only option was to run back to the other side and try a different door, which meant it would take him right past his uncle's room again. He had no choice but to do so. He slowly started to walk, and as he passed by, he couldn't help but peek into that room once more. He saw his uncle standing there with the gun in hand. While my dad was staring at him in shock, his uncle turned around. "You're lucky I let you live tonight." He then put his gun up to his head, and as my dad freaked out and started running away, he heard one final gunshot that night. My dad ran out of the house and kept running down the dirt road, all the way back to his own home. Luckily, his dad was still up with some friends, drinking and playing cards. My dad basically collapsed as he made it back to his front porch and told everyone what happened before passing out. The police went to go investigate and soon found that everyone was dead. A little while later, my dad found out his uncle had quite a few mental issues he hadn't known. He was apparently supposed to be taking medication for it. but he hadn't done so that night. They think that's the reason he went crazy. As you can imagine, my dad was traumatized and had nightmares about this for a long time. Once again, I can assure you this is 100% true as well. I can see it in my dad's eyes whenever he tells me the story. I wish I could have some sort of news article about this, but it was way in the past and in Fiji as well, so of course there's not going to be anything. This happened a couple of months ago in February. I'm in northern New Jersey, so it gets pretty cold up here, especially at night. I live on 10 plus acres. There's a popular trail that runs through the entire northern part of the state and runs just parallel to my property. You can't exactly see the trail from our house, and people on the trail can't view our house either from it. All that being said, it's surprisingly private where my house is located. I'm a 21-year-old female, and I work overnight shifts, so when I come home, everyone else is pretty much leaving for work. I'm home alone until around 6 or 7 at night. With the winter, it gets dark around 5 or 5:30ish. One evening, as I was walking to my kitchen, as usual, I looked out to the fields from the side of my house that was facing them. That part of the house had these big windows and sliding doors. It was almost like a glass house in that area. About a quarter of a mile away or so, I could see a man walking from one side of our property toward the trail. Well, he wasn't really walking though. He was more hunched over and skipping. I really couldn't say for sure. Thanks to having livestock though, we had binoculars handy to check on them, so I snatched them up real quick and took a look at this guy. As I focused in on him, he looked directly over to me. I was just staring at him, and he was staring back with this creepy-ass grin. We both looked at each other until he climbed to the woods and got on the trail. He was now out of sight. I called my dad, and he said it must have been a coincidence or something. Maybe this person just really wanted to get back on the trail. I brushed it off and tried to get more sleep. Before work the next day, though, at around the same time, I saw that same man again. This time, though, I was not standing smack dab right in front of a large window. Instead, I was hiding with the binoculars. I focused on him once again. I jumped back in surprise, though, because somehow he seemed to be staring right into where I was looking. How the hell did he know where I was? I called my dad, and he didn't answer. I told myself, everything is locked up tight, you're fine. He was back on the trail by now, surely. In between the snow on the ground and the clear sky, the sun was about to fall pretty soon. It was still a bit bright in the fields, though. I walked over toward the kitchen, only to see the man once more. This time, though, he was not walking at all. He was just standing there, staring right at me, closer to the house than he ever had been before. I was freaking out now, and I was a bit pissed. I got it into my head that he was cutting through our private property. Now he was just standing there staring at me. I could still see the huge grin on his face, even without the binoculars. That's how close he was. I picked up my cell phone and dialed 911 as the man continued standing there. I explained everything to the dispatcher, who said it could take up to an hour for a cop to arrive. Thankfully, it took only 15 minutes. The man was still out there standing and staring when the cops showed up. I pointed at the police, who were now coming down my driveway. The man turned his head and looked right at them, then turned back to me and smiled even wider. He then fucking bolts right toward me, smiling like a maniac. It wasn't a genuine smile. It was like a forced, fake smile with just his mouth, if you can imagine that. I ran toward the front door and out to the cops. They came out of their cars, and one entered my house. 2 more went around each side. They caught and arrested the man soon after. When they found him, he was pressed right against the opposite side of the window where I was originally standing at, still smiling. I don't know what came of him in the end, but I do know I won't be seeing him again, and he'll never be allowed on my property once more. This happened when I was 17. I was home alone and had just gotten into the shower. I was washing my hair when I heard something in the bathroom. I still had the shampoo on. I tried to open my eyes too fast, and the shampoo ran down into them. I was forced to close them in pain, but I could hear that it sounded like somebody had just opened the bathroom door. I was sure I had locked it, but now I was panicked. I frantically rinsed out my eyes while trying to open them, doing it as soon as I was able to. I opened them completely, and as I looked out the curtain, I could see the bathroom door was now sort of cracked open. A sudden rush of fear washed over me as I turned off the water and yelled out for my mom, hoping to God she would respond. When she didn't, I started shaking. I climbed out of the shower and wrapped a towel around my body. I always lock the bathroom door. Always. No exceptions. I opened the door fully, and to my horror, I could see that all the way down the hall, the front door was now wide open. My bedroom was right next to the bathroom. I remember rushing into it very quickly. I closed and locked the door behind me. My clothes were already on my bed, so I quickly got dressed and tried to think of who to call first. That was when I heard a noise coming from inside my closet behind me. Petrified, I turned around. My closet was closed. I always left it open. I didn't stick around to see who was hiding in there. I sprinted out of the house and over to my friend's home, who lived just a few doors down. Her dad answered the door pretty quickly, and I used their phone to call my mom, who then called the police after. It was absolutely insane. 2 cops showed up at my house, but they didn't find anyone there. When they assured my mom and I that no one was inside, we finally went back inside with them. I saw that my once closed closet door was now wide open. My dad didn't live with us there, but he did help my mom to buy a gun after this. We weren't allowed to get it right away, and we had to sleep in that house without one for quite a while. It was so eerie, especially at night. Nothing ever happened again after, but we didn't feel better and could barely sleep until my mom was finally able to pick up that gun. Living alone is always a risk. I had just moved to a new city, and I was getting used to a new routine. At my old job, I worked from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m., and I was moving to a regular 9 to 5 with completely free weekends. Unfortunately, one of those weekends started out in the worst way I could possibly imagine. I woke up early as I typically did, a bad habit from my old schedule. I wanted to run in a nearby park, but it was still too dark outside to do that. I made some coffee and got dressed for my run, only to decide to relax on the couch and read a bit until it was more light out. For some backstory, this apartment, which I don't live in anymore, was a garden-style apartment on the ground floor of a 4-story townhouse. It had 2 windows facing the street and a patio in front of my door. It was 2 steps up from the street to reach the patio. The city I live in is huge, but my neighborhood was very suburban. You know, family homes, apartment buildings, businesses, and schools. Not typically very busy at any time of day. There was one busy street, though, about 4 blocks away. That morning, I lounged with coffee while waiting for the sun to rise. It was a Saturday, so I wasn't shocked when I saw a figure stumbling by the front windows, slowly swerving here and there. There were a few bars within walking distance, and a drunk wandering by wasn't exactly a new development. That was until he turned around. I guess he was attracted by my illuminated windows, or perhaps the shadow of me moving inside or something. Minutes later, this person trudged down the 2 steps, hesitating at the patio. Then he moved to the window, taking care to slide between the bushes and peer inside. I had curtains on these windows, but they were sheer. I didn't know how much he could see from the outside. I froze in place, somewhat startled and confused. It seemed like years, but he was probably looking inside for about 5 minutes. Then he moved back toward my door. I had a gate with 2 different doors barring this unwanted person from entering, but that didn't seem to deter him at all. I heard the front gate open. Although it was locked, it wasn't that hard to reach in and unlock it from the other side. Then he started jiggling the first doorknob. I shouldn't have been particularly worried. I mean, I had 2 doors with 3 locks on each of them, and deadbolts as well. But something about his determination and the darkness outside had me rushing to the back of the apartment. My landlords, who owned the townhouse above me, had a fenced-in garden. I ran out there to call the cops. When I was waiting on the phone with the cops, I felt pretty safe until I heard scratching at the fence and a jiggling of the handle to the garden door. It was about 15 feet tall and would be too difficult to climb. I went back inside only to find the cops now banging at my door. I sent them around the garden entrance to find the guy, but they never caught him, only found a dirty screwdriver laying on the ground. I never got an update, so I assume the guy was never caught. Nor did he try breaking in anywhere else in the neighborhood, but either way, I hope we don't meet again. Back in the early 2000s, around the age of 13-ish, I'm 26 now by the way, I lived in upstate New York, in the town of Rhinebeck. Rhinebeck is a pretty old and fairly sleepy place, all things considered. Our house was up high on a hill, surrounded by dense woods on all sides, except for the street leading up to it. The house was quiet and incredibly secluded. Our nearest neighbor was about a quarter mile down a winding and poorly maintained road, with only a singular streetlight, much too dim to offer much visibility at all. For this story, I'll need to give you an idea of the layout of the house as well. It was at least 2 stories. The stairs were situated right in the center of the house. Our most common point of entry was through the 2-car garage on the side. The front door was to the right of the garage entry, and standing from that door, you could see up the stairs. At the top of the stairs was my parents' room on the immediate right, and to the left was a hallway with 2 rooms side by side. At the very end were mine and my brother's rooms, situated right over where the garage was. Anyway, on to the story. I'd always been very on edge about where we lived. It gave off a sort of Mothman Prophecies vibe, if you know what I mean. You could hear every single twig snap, every coyote and bird, and when it got dark out, it was real dark. Late one night, I had long since gone to bed when I was jarred awake by a sound below my room. I sat stock still for a moment, listening to the deafening silence before accepting I'd probably just been dreaming. Just as I started to drift back off to sleep though, I heard a scratching sound. It was slow at first and hard to exactly make out. It almost sounded like metal scraping against slate and started to become more deliberate. I pinpointed it to the garage door that entered into the house. My first thought was to go to my parents', but it occurred to me that if I stood outside their door, I would have been easily seen from the bottom of the stairs, should someone actually be inside. The noise continued onward though. Finally, I crawled out of my bed as quietly as possible to lock my bedroom door, then bolted back and covered myself with the covers. It felt like hours passed by. I don't know exactly when, but the scratching did come to a stop by morning. I had pushed it to the back of my mind as all a bad dream. Sitting around the kitchen the next day, I told my parents about how weird it was I dreamt about such a thing. They looked at me very concerned though, and out of curiosity, they went to look at the garage door. What we found on the other side of it were pry marks, as if someone had repeatedly jammed a crowbar into the doorframe and tried to get inside. I stared in disbelief and mild terror. My father changed the lock on the outermost door that led into the garage after, for a much better lock. I grew up in a suburb of Raleigh, North Carolina that has a virtually non-existent crime rate. My father and I moved there when I was about 6. He was always pretty busy though, so I pretty much had to raise myself. Naturally, I attended school there as well. Made all my lifelong relationships there, so on and so forth. In 2008, I was a senior in high school, and I had a very close-knit group of friends, primarily composed of people I'd known since middle school. One such friend had just come back recently from Holly Hill, which was our local mental hospital, after a suicide attempt. Matt had been gone for a couple of weeks. I saw him in the courtyard before heading for class. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to talk to him though, so all I said to him was, "Welcome back, I missed you." I didn't want to risk being late for class, but I would have if I had known that was the last thing I would ever say to him. Matt had suffered from depression and dementia for years, but he kept a pretty good rap on all the details, so none of his friends really had an inkling of how severe it was. That was until the aforementioned attempt. We got out of school for Thanksgiving break, and one of our mutual friends messaged me on Facebook asking if I would like to go paintballing with them on the night of the 30th. I had to turn them down because I had to see my grandparents the next morning for a late Thanksgiving celebration. It wasn't really that big of a deal, just kind of a disappointment. Break came and went. We went back to school and Matt was once again absent. There had been a rumor floating around that he had run away from home and gone back to Washington, D.C. to look for his birth mother or something. I wasn't really sure I believed that though, especially that he would go off on this long-term trip without mentioning it to me first. In between switching classes, I tried to call him on his cell phone, but it was off. I didn't think anything of it though. A few days later during lunchtime, there was some buzz around school that Allegra, one of our mutual friends, and Adele, someone else who was more like an acquaintance than friends with us, but we still knew of, had been taken out of class and arrested. We had no idea what happened, but I had a strange feeling this had something to do with Matt's absence. After that, all I could really think about was where Matt was. I also thought about the fact that Allegra sat behind me in Shakespeare class, and she had been really tired the day Matt disappeared. She slept all through class that day. The school tried to keep everything quiet in regards to the students theorizing and talking to one another, but it was high school and word travels fast. Whenever we weren't talking, we were all texting each other about it. Our local news website reported in an article that 4 of Matt's friends had been arrested in connection with a body found in Allegra's parents' summer home. You guessed it, it was Matt. After a while, Allegra and 2 of the people from Matt's circle of friends went on trial. Allegra received 2 consecutive 20-year terms for conspiracy to commit murder and murder in the 2nd degree. Adele received the same. The 2 others in the trial received a life sentence for first-degree murder. As I watched the trial unfold, I found out that they'd all killed him together on the night of November 30th, the very same night they'd asked me to come paintballing with them. There was a long period of time when I kicked myself for not going that night. I always think that if I would have gone, maybe I could have had some small influence in stopping them from doing what they did that night. Growing up, I always wanted to go on a bike ride at night. Something about it just seemed really cool to me. It wasn't until I was about 13 that my mom finally let me. She told me, of course, to wear my helmet, have my phone, take a great flashlight with me. She set the parameters for where I was allowed to go, too. She gave me about 4 miles to work with, which was a lot to me. Right after sunset, I set off on my little adventure. I loved it. There were no people out walking their dogs or kids running around everywhere. The temperature was perfect as well. It was really fun. So fun that I accidentally ignored the limits my mom had set out for me. You see, where I was biking was all pretty much walking paths. It was one of those grassy areas in between two neighborhoods where there's a long path that goes down at least 600 feet. It went down at a 25-degree angle too, so I was flying down this hill having an absolute blast. I darted right past the parameters my mom had set. My mom had set these limits for a reason. Everything on the inside was close to houses, and people as well. The outside of that area was pretty barren though. I rode along this path for about 10 minutes before I could only see faint lights from the houses behind me. I was just on the outside of the city limits now. After about 15 minutes of riding along this dirt path, I started to hear singing. It sounded about 30 to 40 feet in front of me. I stopped riding to hear it better. It was a woman's voice, and she was singing Eleanor Rigby by the Beatles. She wasn't singing the words though, just the melody, and her voice was quite strange as well. You know how when you have excess phlegm in your throat and your voice gets all scratchy? That's what her voice sounded like. I inched forward to try and get a better idea of what was going on. As I got close enough, I could see a silhouette of some woman bouncing up and down, like she was headbanging or something. I decided to get my flashlight out. I thought maybe this was a person in need of help or something, or maybe a person out partying. If I shined a light on them, maybe it would scare them away. I took the flashlight out of my pocket and pointed at her. Then I turned it on. The instant the light hit her, she stopped moving. She was completely facing away from me. She had this disgusting hair that seemed to be sticking together in clumps. Some of it was ripped off, too. She was wearing this oversized bright red hoodie. I was too scared to move. I almost thought she was scared of me, too. I conjured up as much bravery as I could and said, "I'm sorry to interrupt you." It was a very, "oops, this is the wrong room" kind of thing. She didn't respond at all. I turned off the flashlight and put it back in my pocket. Just as I was turning around though, she started screaming in this awful high-pitched voice. I damn near shat myself as I jumped back onto my bike. I could hear her voice getting closer behind me. I booked it as fast as I could. I didn't look behind me, and I didn't stop pedaling either. She was still screaming, and it appeared she was trying to follow me, but she grew quieter and quieter until eventually the noise dissolved into the night. I'm in my mid-20s, and I consider myself to be a pretty small woman, both in height and in weight. I've never taken any self-defense classes, and I would be in a pretty big pickle if someone were to actually attack me. At present, I live in a small suburb just outside of Boston, with 2 other female roommates. We live in a condominium complex that has roughly 200 units or so. Our condo happens to be in the farthest corner of the grounds. We were the last unit in a row of 10, with woods to our left. The back area we lived in was also widely regarded as a high-crime area. It was the sketchy part of town. I was never genuinely concerned about my safety though, until one night in October of 2015. I had just flown back into Boston from a work trip in Tampa, Florida. My flight arrived at Logan Airport around 10:30 p.m. or so. Between gathering my luggage and car, I didn't make it back to my apartment until midnight. I locked my car and grabbed my suitcase, then headed inside to my empty apartment. I wasn't too worried about staying in the condo alone at the moment. It was already a pretty typical situation, with my roommates often working late or staying out with their boyfriends. I always locked the screen door, then the wooden door after. I felt like that was enough protection from the outside world. I was greeted by my cat when I went into my room. I noticed though that the temperature was unusually warm for October. I opened all my windows and crawled into bed. I should note, as I mentioned before, the back side of the apartment was surrounded by woods. We have a row of parking spaces directly behind us, but other than that, it's strictly forest. That particular night, I had been lucky enough to find a parking spot directly beneath my bedroom window. At 3:30 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps and rustling outside. I figured it was one of the other residents either getting back from the bar or grabbing something from their vehicle, so I rolled over to try and fall back asleep. After about 4 or 5 minutes of this loud, continuous rustling, though, I decided to check out what was going on. To my horror, as I looked outside, there was a massive man wearing all black clothing and a black mask as well. He was inside the passenger door of my car, going through all my belongings. I was so shocked to see that someone was inside it that it took me a few moments to understand what was going on. Realizing someone had broken into my car, I immediately panicked. I have a spare apartment key inside my glove box, which was the area they were searching. My apartment door was only a few steps away from where he was standing too. I knew that fleeing was not an option, as he was blocking the only exit. I knew that if he were to use that key to get inside, I would be in a very dangerous situation. Out of pure stupidity, I grabbed my car keys and hit the lock button, which caused my car to beep loudly. The beep startled the man who was in my car so much that he backed up and stumbled onto the curb. In an instant, his eyes shot up to my bedroom window. When our eyes met, he knew that I had seen him in my car. To my dismay, he stared without even flinching. I was so terrified I backed away from the window. I immediately ran into my roommate's closet and dialed 911. I reported the situation in a hushed whisper, fully expecting the man to break in and find me inside her room. It took officers 12 minutes to arrive at my condo, in which time the guy had long since taken off. I don't really know how he was able to get into my car so easily that night, as I'm sure I'd locked it. Amazingly, nothing was taken except for that key. I didn't have much in there anyway. The other scary thing is that the latch on our screen door was completely broken off. I didn't hear him trying to gain entry into my home, but I was also in the closet and on the phone with police, so who knows what I didn't hear in that moment. All I can really say is I'm lucky I had my windows open that night and interrupted him. Otherwise, he might have used that key to get in without me knowing. This happened to me about 6 or 7 years ago. I'm a female and I was 17 at the time. It was the beginning of summer and I was traveling to my summer home like I did every year. I live in a small southeastern European country and this is pretty normal for a lot of people here. I would usually travel by train overnight because I would use that time to get sleep for most of the trip, and the train took about 8 hours to get there. It didn't cross a great distance, it was just really slow. Anyway, I've done that same trip alone a couple of times already, and I've never really had a problem before. My country is pretty safe anyway, so taking a trip on my own was never really a concern for me. The train left at around 11 p.m. and was scheduled to arrive at 7 in the morning. That meant I had 7 to 8 hours of sleep, which was pretty perfect for me. At first, I was alone in the compartment, but after I got settled in, a girl about my age asked if she could join me inside. I said yes, and we started talking a bit. You know, the usual. Where are you from? How old are you? What do you do? Even though I was comfortable traveling alone and was much bigger than her and a year older, I was still happy that someone else was there with me. We talked until midnight and decided to get some sleep, since the train was pretty empty other than us. Since it was just the two of us, we could lie down fully in the compartment and have 3 seats on each side to our own. We spread across those seats. I just started to doze off when I heard our compartment door opening. There was a man just standing in the doorway. He looked at us for a second, then called out to us, "Hey, you got any room for me?" Now, what was weird about this first of all was that this compartment was so empty that I was certain the one he'd just come from must have been fairly empty as well. Secondly, he saw both of us lying down taking up all the space, so there was no need to ask. Finally, it was the strange way he phrased it as well. I squirmed a little bit and started to answer, but he left the second I started moving around. I remember him closing the door as I was about to say something, and I thought it was so weird. Whatever, my sleepy brain didn't really want to bother with it, so I forgot about it pretty much instantly. I think the girl and I exchanged a what the fuck look first though. That was pretty much it. Not more than 5 minutes passed by when he appeared once again, quietly opening the door and asking if we had any room for him. I was a stupid, scared kid back then, so I stayed silent and pretended to be asleep. Luckily, the other girl was smarter than me. She sort of yelled at him. "No, dude, you can see there's no room. We're trying to sleep, so can you leave or something?" He just stared at us with this empty, vacant expression. I saw something in his eyes that could only be described as sinister. He then quietly closed the door and slunk away. I kind of chuckled, probably my nerves acting up on me. The girl smiled at me, and that was pretty much it. I somehow managed to fall asleep again, though it was a very light sleep. I kept on waking up throughout the night for some reason, though. Maybe that was for the better. The girl and I went our separate ways in the morning, as we were both traveling further. I didn't have Facebook back then, so I couldn't stay in contact with her. I've forgotten her name over the years as well, although for some reason as I'm writing this, I want to say her name was Ivana or something. I'll always be grateful to her though for standing up for me that night, and for teaching me that you should stand up for yourself, even if you're a small, fragile-looking girl. We didn't get a good look at the guy because it was so dark, but my impression back then was that he must have been in his 40s, and he had no reason to keep coming back over and over. If he wanted to sleep, the compartment he'd come from was already empty, and that's why I think he had something else in mind. I'm happy that girl was there with me, because I have no idea what he would have done if I was on my own like I'd originally planned. I'd like to think I would have stood up for myself, but honestly, I have no idea. I'm a 29-year-old guy from Brazil. I'm a teacher at a university here, and I practice Kung Fu in my spare time. The political scene in Brazil is insane these days. I've even heard stories about people getting attacked on the streets in broad daylight just because they're wearing red, which happens to be the color of the president's political party. A few days ago, I was heading home from work late one night. It was around 11 p.m. or so. I got on the bus, but as there were no seats available, I stood near the exit door as I usually do. I got my MP3 player out from my backpack. Yeah, I do still carry around an MP3 player. I turned on some Black Dahlia. There I was, minding my own business, silently singing along, when I noticed a guy sitting in the back of the bus. He was staring at me with this really weird look on his face. I actually thought it was kind of funny at first, but when he didn't stop staring, I figured he must have just been lost in his thoughts or something, and happened to be looking in my direction. I went over to the other side and glanced up at him again. You guessed it, he was still staring right at me. I started paying more attention to this guy. Even sitting down, he was absolutely huge. His arms were as thick as my legs. He looked like the fucking Hulk from those old movies. I was really tired already from work that day, so I just shrugged it off and went back to minding my own business. Maybe he was just jealous of my awesome beard or something. Point is, I had no energy to deal with that right then. Maybe I was just being paranoid anyway. My stop was soon coming up, so I pulled the string. I don't know how buses work where you guys live, but here we have these little strings attached to the ceiling, and when you want to get off, you just pull down on them. A few seconds later, the bus driver stopped, and I got off the bus. Before I did, I saw that huge guy get up as well and glare at me. I started walking, feeling a bit nervous now. When I looked back, there he was, tailing right behind me. He didn't even bother pretending he was going home or something. His eyes were just dead locked on me the entire time. I started walking much faster. I could hear his footsteps also picking up the pace. My street was on the next left, and it was very, very dark out. I realized I would have to run if I didn't want this guy to catch up to me. As soon as I turned the corner, I ran like there was no tomorrow, which was exactly the case, I think. I heard the guy start to run as well. There was no way I would outrun him to my house. Not so far away, so I decided to go all in. I stopped and turned to face him. I took off my backpack and held it in my hand. He yelled something at me, then jumped in to attack me. I threw my backpack at his face. When it was just about to hit though, he dodged by it. I even saw a smile on his face, like he thought it was fun I was fighting back. Well, turns out that's exactly what I had been waiting for. I've been practicing Kung Fu for over 10 years now, so when he moved to dodge the backpack, my right foot was already waiting to crack his jaw. It was only a fraction of a second, but I saw his smile immediately turn into a sour expression as my foot smashed into the side of his face. His eyes rolled back into his head, and he dropped to the sidewalk instantly. I grabbed my backpack, and before I booked it back to my house, I saw a shiny object sticking out of his pocket, clearly a knife. This guy must have wanted to do some serious damage, and who knows why, because I have a beard and was wearing a red shirt? If it wasn't for my passion for martial arts, I probably would have never saw my wife and kids again that night. I won't lie to you and say I had it all under control and I was some kung fu master or something, or that it was all okay and I didn't feel scared at all. I was scared as shit. By the time I got home, my legs were shaking so bad, I had to ask my wife to help me to the nearest chair. She asked what was going on, and I told her what happened. We called the police, but I guess by the time they got there, the guy had woken up and was already gone. We're moving to a new place in a few days. After all, he followed me all the way to my street. Who knows? He could still be looking for me. The good part is, my wife has always nagged me for doing my kung fu, and after this happened, she ordered me to keep practicing. She thought about joining as well, and bringing the kids too, so now we have something extra to bond over. In 2003, I was a senior in college. I had the opportunity to travel to Chicago to work at an international trade show for my family business. Trade shows are all about getting new customers, and this particular show brings in tens of thousands of potential ones every year from every corner of the world. People who may be needing some industrial equipment, conveyors, case erectors, robots, etc. When I'm working at one of these things, I have to be outgoing, perky, and friendly, so whenever anyone would walk by, I would attempt to engage them in conversation. Conversations turn into leads, and leads turn into sales. That is, except when the only thing the guy wants is to buy a bride. It was the second day of the show, and my dad and the other salesmen were off getting lunch. That was when a very short and attractive man in his mid-60s stopped by the booth. I engaged with him and we discussed his industry, pharmaceuticals I supposed, as I scanned his badge. He didn't leave after the conversation ended though. Instead, he started complimenting me and staring at me. Me being 19 and working this as my first show, I didn't quite know what the boundaries were yet. I took it all in stride as gracefully as I could and tried to direct him to a more business-related topic. It didn't work, obviously. He started leering at me, telling me how well off he was and how I would make a great wife for him. After about 15 minutes of this and other customers coming up as well, he picked up one of my dad's business cards and left. I thought that was that. I laughed about this later actually with one of the guys across the aisle, and even with my dad too. That was until that night, when my dad's cell phone started ringing. The call was from me apparently. My Prince Charming had called every hotel associated with the show until he found the exact one where we were staying. Apparently he was waiting outside right now with a limo. He explained that he wanted to take me to dinner so he could talk to me about taking me back to Jordan with him and becoming his wife. Me still being stupidly concerned about alienating a future customer, I told him I had dinner plans already and couldn't meet with him now. He insisted that we go out tomorrow instead. We argued back and forth for about a minute, and eventually I told him that wouldn't be appropriate. I had dinner plans with vendors all week already. I hung up right after. Dad ignored a few more missed calls from him. I was mercilessly teased about my Jordanian husband at dinner. However, when the guy showed up at the booth again the next day with an entire entourage and tried to negotiate an honest-to-God marriage contract with my dad, it wasn't quite as funny anymore. I'm not sure what exactly my dad said to him, but we didn't sell anything to that creepy pharmaceutical plant owner from Jordan, and I still get nervous when I see him at shows. I work in retail, and I have a very unique name. This happened a few years ago when I first started working at a 24-hour convenience store. At this point, I was working the graveyard shift. I'm used to all types of unsavory folks, but there was this one guy who left me very unsettled. It was about 3 a.m. or so, and unfortunately, I was working all alone. My coworker decided to call out the last minute. The store was pretty much dead, and I was packing out a delivery when the man walked in. He was a short, stocky black guy, a little older than me probably, late 20s to early 30s. I looked up from the task at hand and greeted him with a friendly smile. I asked him if he needed help with anything. He grinned and looked me up and down, his brown eyes darkening with lust. "Oh yes, did you say you sell condoms?" I nodded and pointed him to the health and beauty section, then proceeded to make my way to the register. He browsed for a bit and picked up a box of Magnums and some of those herbal sexual supplement pills. "So, how are you?" he inquired. I told him I was fine, working hard, and anxious to go home. His eyes traveled up and down my body, settling on my name tag, which was pinned just beneath my left breast. I felt a little bit uncomfortable. I'd never been uncomfortable with people staring at me, but this guy's eyes lingered so much longer than necessary. He asked me how to pronounce my name, and I told him simply. He started to compliment me, and I said thank you, and began to scan and bag his items, trying to avoid eye contact with him. When he asked if I had a boyfriend, I truthfully told him yes. He commented that he must be a lucky man, and that he wished he could be in his shoes. I smiled uncomfortably. I asked him if he needed anything else, as we're supposed to do. "Not a lot. I just need you now." I was getting annoyed at this point. I ignored him and proceeded to tell him his total. He swiped his card and I completed the transaction. I told him to have a good night. Then he turned around and asked me if I was working all by myself. I told him my coworker was downstairs doing some paperwork. Then the guy grinned. "No, he isn't. I've been watching you since 12 o'clock. I haven't seen a single other person here all this time. Are you afraid of me?" I frowned. "You've been watching me? That's hella creepy, dude." I told him he needed to leave if he was done shopping, because I had work to complete. Once again, he laughed. I thought he was going to try and attack me or something, but then a group of guys walked in. He fled as soon as he saw them approaching. Later that night, I checked my Facebook, only to see I had a new friend request. Guess who it was from? Again, I have a very unique name, and I've only found 2 other people on Facebook that have it. After I searched it out of curiosity, I blocked and deleted the friend request. Next morning, as I'm walking to the subway station, a wanted poster on the token booth caught my eye. The face was very familiar. It was the creep from my store that other night. He was wanted for sexual assault and battery. The incident happened more than a month ago. I told my manager, who called the police, and gave them our tip. I don't know if he was ever caught, but I hope we don't meet ever again. I still don't feel comfortable with name tags after. So this happened a while back when I was in my early 20s. I was working at a small retail store in my town's mall. It was coming up to the end half of the day, and I don't know how I noticed it, but an older man, probably in his 50s, I'm not quite sure, had walked past my store 3 or 4 times. Not consecutively, mind you, just every now and then he would return to pass by. I worked at one of those little custom jewelry stores, so it was odd for an older male to be walking past so many times. I didn't really think that much of it though. It soon came to closing time, and I had to catch my bus home at around 6:30 p.m. I remember it was transitioning into winter because it was so dark out by then. I'm a very paranoid person by nature, and I still live by the rules of stranger danger. Even now, when I leave work, I make sure I change into an outfit that's less fashionable. I don't like drawing attention to myself in any way possible, so I try to make sure I'm as covered up and average looking as I can. I don't know why, but I have that disease where I seem to attract all the wrong attention on no part of my own. As I said, I was waiting for my bus home, sitting by myself at the town center bus terminal, when guess who walks by? That very same older man from earlier. At this point, I started to feel a bit uneasy. In my head, I tried to make reason prevail. Many people take these buses all the damn time. My bus showed up soon after anyway, and I got on real quick. Well, you can imagine who hopped on just after me. I remember sitting at one of the seats facing inward, the ones for wheelchairs and prams. He sat at the first seat above the steps. I remember just staring forward, feeling his eyes burning into me. I kept trying to use my peripheral vision to see if he was looking at me, not wanting him to know that I'd noticed him. The whole bus ride, I waited as he stared at me to see if he would get off before my stop. Maybe I was just being overly anxious and paranoid. You know, a paranoid mind from working overtime. That was until I pressed the button for my stop. I waited until the last possible second to do so, and immediately as I stood up, he did too. I went to walk to the front door of the bus. He exited at the rear at that very same moment. As soon as he stepped off though, I sat back down. I had no idea where the bus would go after my stop, but I honestly didn't care. I'll never forget the look on that guy's face as the bus drove off without him. I'd never seen such anger and hatred in a person's face before as I did through that window. His face is still burnt into my memory, almost like a photograph. It still terrifies me to this day. I have no idea what would have happened to me if I had gotten off at my proper stop that night, but I'm glad my paranoia was so intense that I did not. I can't imagine it would have been anything good.